Hello, this is Caitlin from Ragamuffin Pet Photography. I've had a lot of people send me questions in on the blog and on Facebook asking me how I achieve the larger group photos, and I can tell you straight off the bat that it isn't, well, one, it's not magic, and two, it's not just amazing miracle dog handling of 8-week-old puppies. A lot of it is done later in post-production and in Photoshop. So I thought today I would take you through basically how I would put together a large group photo like this, and I'll also let you know as we go through how I shot it as well. So just to give you a real basic overview of how I would composite the group photo together, because I'm going to leave the sped up production going in the background while I chat to you. But basically what I do for most of the editing is I use masks and brush tools. You could do something a bit more precise, like use the pen tool, but to be honest, I've always used masks and it works fine for me. I just vary the hardness depending on whether or not I'm going around an edge or I'm doing something a little bit more feathered for the background. I will get more into the nitty-gritty details of my editing techniques, but I did think to start with I'll just give you a basic overview of how this was shot in the first place, because there are a few rules that you should try to stick to if you're going to composite a group photo together, particularly one with this many dogs. There are 18 7-week-old puppies, 2 adults, their mums, and 1 12-week-old puppy for this. So you can imagine it would be near on impossible to get them all in a single photo. Even if you did, they're not all going to be doing adorable things like they are in the finished photo that we produced. So basically what I did is we set up the actual set first, which is those haystacks and the wheelbarrow, the shoes and the saddle. And then I set up my tripod. I don't usually shoot on a tripod unless it's for something like a group photo that I know I'm going to be compositing. And the reason for that is that I don't want my camera to move at all. You can do it handheld, but you're just going to make it a lot harder for yourself later in post-production, because you'll find that if you move just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, then the angle's going to be off and it's just a real pain. So I set it on a tripod and I've got a remote there too, so my hand's not even going to be moving it. And we set up a little crate around the tripod so that no cheeky little puppies come and bump it. It's not a huge deal, but sorry, that's a kitten playing with a Christmas toy. It's not a huge deal, but you can fix it later. I photographed the 2 adult dogs first just because I wanted them to be the main focus of the photo and have the puppies all around, so they were going to be the anchor. And then once I had those 2 adults done, then I did all of the little 7-week-old puppies 2 at a time. Now, you'd think it would be easier from a handling point of view to photograph them 1 at a time, but the issue with that is you're not going to get any of that skin-to-skin contact, no smushing of the faces together, nothing, no interaction between them. And then if they're all done all individually and they're not interacting, it's just not going to look as realistic in the finished photograph. So I've skipped a little bit ahead in this playback here because I forgot to keep recording. But basically, as you can see, like those 2 first ones, they were photographed together. The 2 other ones in the wheelbarrow, they were photographed together, but I didn't necessarily use each, like I've used portions of each photograph rather than the finished one of the 2 of them together. So basically what I did once we finished the shoot is I came back and I went through all the shots and I had a marker in between so I knew which puppy was which, because they're very similar looking. It would have driven me crazy if I had to remember. So I had markers and I've gone through in Lightroom and I've flagged the ones that I want to actually bring into Photoshop. And then they're all brought in as layers in a single file. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm just adding 1 puppy at a time. And as you can see here, I'm using a reasonably hard brush tool. It's something that it's probably on sort of 80, maybe even 90. That's just so that you get a realistic edge. Now, if they were fluffy puppies and I was dealing with hair, then I would probably use a softer brush so I could retain a little bit of the detail in the hair. Because I had that tripod mounted, then I don't really have to worry about the background moving or that sort of thing. You can see that there are differences in the background, but that's due to the sunlight changing. Because what I didn't take into consideration when I locked off my exposure was that being so close to sunset, the light was varying a fair amount, but it is something that you can just combat later in Photoshop, and I'll show you how to do that. The alternative would have been to keep trying to adjust say my shutter speed on my ISO, because you don't want to move the aperture, but I'd rather just keep shooting quickly and tweak it later. So that's why the background does change a little bit. That's because the sun's moving in the background. The way I actually tackle the positioning of the dogs is I give a real rough white brush stroke over the mask so that I can see it without seeing all the rest of the background. The puppy's just by itself. And then I just use the cursor tool to sort of fine tune the positioning. You can move it a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and then go in again with the brush, fine tune that mask. It's a lot of, you do that basic one and then you fine tune and then you fine tune and then you fine tune, and then 2.5 hours later you're finally with something that is perfect. But you do have to be patient with yourself, because it is a lot of real detail work there. Like you can see I'm zooming into, I don't know, that must be like 500% just to get the perfect background. And you can, like you'll see there, like I chopped up a little bit of his arm. I mean, puppies are bony, dogs are bony. You can sort of mold them a little bit so it looks more realistic. You don't have to stick exactly to the actual contour of their body, I don't think, anyway. I see that issue there where the background's coming into his arm. That's because the other mask that I've done of the puppy, there's not enough of the black, so that's still coming in, and it's all to do with like which layers on top of which. So before I switched the puppy so he was underneath, because I want this one who's sitting up like that I'm working on right now, I want him to be in front of the other puppy. I mean, you could separate them all out so you didn't have to deal with that skin on skin, but as I said before, I think skin on skin looks more realistic as long as you can work your shadows in an appropriate way. So I'm just going to skip a little ahead here. It's more of the same, pretty much, just moving and adjusting until it looks quite right. Okay, now here's a little bit of an issue, because even though my tripod is locked up, because I want to move the puppies so they're in the perfect spot on that haystack, it's not necessarily the spot that they were actually in. So for example, this puppy that's all the way to the right, clearly from the look of the haystack he was even more towards the edge, but I think that would look a bit silly. So you sort of got to use a little bit of creativity there and match the edges as best you can. You can see I'm sort of playing around. I'm like, should I add in this bit? I take it out in the end. But it's just something it's not going to match up perfectly because I want him in the right spot rather than the haystack in the right spot. But the beauty of the haystack and the beauty of grass and basically everything that you're photographing dogs on anyway is that it's a natural pattern. So you can be a little bit lenient with how much things match up. As long as it sort of comes together in the final bit, it should look fine. So my next step were these little puppies over here. You can see that they're resting on something brown. That's actually my hoodie. The reason for that was that the puppies weren't overly keen on resting their little soft bellies on the scratchy hay, so we just popped my hoodie down so they had something comfy to rest on. I could have had them all sitting up, but again, that's just going to look so posed. I mean, obviously the finished photo looks posed, but if they're all sitting in the same spot or they're all sitting up perkily, it's not going to look realistic, and B, it's going to look kind of boring. So I wanted them doing different things, which you'll see that come up later too. Like I experiment a little bit more with the actual poses that they're in, but I definitely wanted them lying down. So I sort of had to go, you know what, I'll pop my hoodie down, we can Photoshop it out later, and then they'll be on their little cute bellies. It's important not to be too strict with whatever plan you come up with on location in terms of where your animals are going to go, because once you bring everything in Photoshop, you might find that it just doesn't work the way that you planned it. So for example, I wanted that little standing up puppy on the other side of the haystack, but then once I brought everything in, I've sort of gone, you know what, he looks better up here. It's more to do with the symmetry because the adult dogs are quite high up, so I sort of wanted a triangular shape for the composition, which if he's standing up, we get the triangle coming up on the right side up to the top of the adults, and then we get it coming down on the left side through the haystack and the wheelbarrow. So I moved those two little puppies, I moved them over towards the left, which is what I'm doing here, which did mean I have to remark the mask again. Here I'm just getting rid of Sonia in the background, she's their mum. And then I brought little standing up puppy over here where he can do his thing. One issue that you are going to come up against when you're photographing really young puppies, like these 7-week-old puppies, is actually getting them to look up at the camera. If you're photographing like 12-week-old puppies, 16-week-old puppies, that's not an issue. You're going to be able to get them to respond to toys and food, but a little 7-week-old puppy or even younger, their hearing and their sight isn't that well developed yet. They're really just looking straight ahead, straight at themselves, straight at the ground in front of them. There's no way that they're going to be able to look up at a tripod however many meters away. So that's where you need a team effort. So we had Sonia there, we had a couple of her friends there too. We were clapping, we were using treats, we were throwing toys, anything just to get their heads up. Obviously that little wheelbarrow puppy there, he's looking down, and there's a few where they're looking away, but that's another one of those issues where you don't really want them all looking exactly the same because it's just going to look a bit silly, and realistically you're not going to get them all looking right at the camera and doing something cute at the same time. So for example, little puppy sitting in the boot lying down, he's not looking right at the camera but he looks adorable, so let's pick that one. I came back into Lightroom because I didn't like the photo that I'd chosen for that little puppy, so I went and picked another one. That's pretty easy, just open in Photoshop and then drag it back into the same spot. Obviously he was a little bit further across, but that's another one of those things where you can sort of take some liberties and move it to a different position as long as the basic background matches up, and you can do a little bit of mushing and molding like I just did around that other puppy's leg. It's going to work out fine. And then this other puppy too, I didn't like his one, and I remembered that there was that adorable photo of him jumping down off the saddle, and I decided, yeah, that's better, so I'll bring that one in. Which didn't mean I ended up moving those other 3 across a little bit, just I felt like it suited the composition a bit more because initially he had meant to be up on the haystack with them, so I'd left space for that. But I prefer him running down the saddle, so then I had to scooch them across, which means, again, reworking the masks, but it's okay. It's all part of it. And now I've used the background of little saddle puppy because the sun was sort of a little bit further down by that stage by the time we were shooting him, so that the background's a little less contrastier. And I want my not raw, but I want the initial edit that I work with before I start bringing in layers and levels and curves and color balance and all of that. I want that as low con neutral as possible, which in Lightroom I've already upped the shadows, brought down the highlights, everything, so that there's as much detail there for me to work with in Photoshop. So right now all I'm doing is I'm just bringing all the different backgrounds together so that we've got one natural, realistic looking one where the light sort of works, which did need a little bit of fine-tuning around the 2 adults because they were done earliest in the day when the sun was still reasonably high up. So theirs was more contrastier behind their head, but that's just, again, that's just using a hard brush to come in and get it really perfect behind them. Okay, so all the compositing is pretty much done. Please note that I don't stamp visible at this stage. I know that some people would do that. But you never know when you're going to need to go back and just fiddle a little bit. So I don't stamp visible because there's still a little bit more Photoshop work to be done. My next step was to crop it. I already know because I discussed with Sonia that we're going to do a big panoramic framed print. It's a surprise for her husband, so I am going to go ahead and crop that to the panoramic composition that I imagined right from the start, which is why I had all that extra space above them and below them. It's not interesting space. But it's there so that I could crop in. Right, see? I need to go back and edit my masks again because I just keep doing that. So lucky I didn't stamp visible. And then my next step is just to go around, do a little bit of a vignette. I actually have an action for this, but my iMac's in the shop getting fixed, so I'm editing this on my laptop and I don't have all my my vignette actions and all of those imported. So that was just on a multiply layer, bring a little bit of a real soft black brush across. So that's the first half of this video with the majority of the compositing work finished. If you'd like to see the photo be completed, just click the link below to watch the next video. So the first step that I would always add is a curves adjustment layer. The first thing that I'd do is I'd just raise those blacks up a bit. I pretty much do this for all my photographs. So I raise the blacks up and then I drop them down sort of maybe 10 in on the input. And then I bring the midtones to highlights up a little bit just to retain that punchy aspect of it. But then you've got that real matte look. Then I'm going into my color balance, which is another important aspect to my style of photography. It's pretty much adding a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red into the midtones. That way I get that punchy but warm look. And then I'll probably drag a little bit of blue into the shadows. It's not a split tone per se, but it is technically. It just doesn't have that brassy split tone look that you will get from sort of a lot of out-of-the-box actions maybe that I know people buy. And then I'll add a little bit of yellow into the highlights. It varies obviously depending on the photograph, but there's somewhat of a formula just to get that initial look for the photographs, which is that curves, color balance, and then my last step would be a levels layer. And I'm actually gonna clip a little bit of the blacks normally. It seems counterintuitive given that I've just raised the blacks, but I've raised them to give them that matte look, and then I'm going to clip them so that they're punchy when they print without being contrasty. But don't judge that look of it just yet. This is still fairly early on in my adjustments. The next step is basically refining those curves, color balance, and levels just to get a basic look that I'm happy with before I go in and do individual adjustments on, say, for example, those puppies up the top, which look a little bit too light and that sort of thing. At this point, I'm going back into my masks and I'm refining the background once again because I just felt like that tree was a little bit too bright. So I'm going to fix that. And then I also went into the wheelbarrow and I fixed up the hay because I didn't feel like that was sitting quite right, the hay coming over the edge. The next step I'm doing is darkening the grass in front of the puppies. I'm just using that same layer that I used for the vignette in the overlay mode, and I'm using black, I believe. The reason I'm doing this is because naturally our eyes are drawn to the lightest part of an image, and I want the viewer's eyes drawn to the puppies. So I want to darken the grass and the sky and that sort of thing. Just not with a real tacky vignette or anything, nothing too obvious, but just something real subtle that's going to bring their eyes in towards the puppies. And I do this a lot, like I'll darken the backgrounds so that your eyes are immediately drawn right into the dog and the soul of the image. What I'm doing now is I'm basically creating a non-destructive dodge burn layer. All I'm doing is I'm putting it in soft light mode. I'm filling with neutral color for soft light, which is 50% gray. And then I've got a non-destructive dodge and burn. So I can use black to darken and I can use white to lighten, and I don't have to stamp visible. I don't have to actually affect any of my pixels, and I don't have to deal with that saturation issue that you do deal with dodge and burn. I mean, you can put your dodge and burn into luminance mode if you do want to use the actual dodge and burn tool, but I find doing something non-destructive like this is so much easier. If I make a mistake, I can just go over in 50% gray and then the problem's fixed, you know? I don't like working destructively. So here I'm just, any of the lighter areas I'm pretty much darkening, and any of the darker areas I'm lightening. The reason I'm, like, that's a real general rule there, but like the hay is another one of those things that I was referring to where I don't want the viewer's eyes drawn to the hay, but it's quite a bright part of the image. and I find it a little bit distracting the way the sun's bouncing off it, and it's not white, but it's really bright. So I'm darkening the hay. And then their faces, those are the parts of the image that I want you to look at. So I'm lightening their faces slightly. It's probably on 10% or maybe 20%, just something really soft most of the time, unless you need to lighten it significantly, but I generally just use a levels or something like that in that case. I felt like the two adult dogs still really stood out in terms of the vibrancy of their coats. I feel like they're a lot redder than the rest of the dogs. I don't know if that's because they were photographed first so that the sun was bouncing a little more off their fur. I'm not sure what that is, but I found it distracting. So I went back down to their layers, and I've just gone in with a hue saturation layer, and I'm bringing down the red specifically on their photos. I did put the certain groupings into group folders to make it a little bit easier. So that's those folders that you can see down on the right hand side in my layers. So I've just dropped their red saturation down a wee bit, and I feel like now they match the levels of the other puppies a little bit more. That little wrinkly baby in the wheelbarrow, I think I felt like he was a little bit too saturated as well, so I dropped him down. Basically, I'm just bringing them all so they're on one level, and you'll see why I do that in a minute. I did a bunch of extra dodging and burning, which I've cut out because boring. And the next step is I did finally stamp visible, and I've brought up a shadows highlight layer, which if you didn't see that, that's up in the adjustments. And all I'm doing is I'm raising the shadows up a little bit more, and I'm also recovering a little bit of the highlights. You will have twigged on by now that a lot of what I do is bringing back details into the shadows and bringing back details into the highlights. And I've got rid of that black clip and white clip. We don't want clipping necessarily, or at least we don't want to do it in here. We can do it later in levels. And I sort of just fiddle around with the amount and the tonal width and the radius too until you find something that looks like what you want. See how it's quite ugly around those trees on the right hand side? I do get rid of that later. What I'm looking more at is the look of the dogs. So then I'm bringing in another color balance layer, and like there's a lot of layers added there. I have to bring it up on top because I stamped visible for the shadows and highlights layer. So now any more adjustments I have to make, I have to do that on top. Even with the extra detail brought back into the highlights from the shadow highlights layer, I still don't like how bright the sky is looking and how cool it's looking compared to the warmth of the dogs. So what I've done is in multiply mode, I've got that warm, real light warm color, and I'm just painting over the sky there. Just it's not a huge difference when you look at it by itself, but when you look at the overall image, it does make a difference, and it's just gonna get rid of that real cool glaring white in the background. Now I'm really getting into like the nitpicky, finicky details of the image, and the other thing that's sticking out to me is that I think her nipples, teats, look pretty blue or magenta-y, and they sort of stand out to me as well. So all I've done is I've used a hue saturation level there, and I was right, it was magenta. I've just used the color picker so that there's not too much guesswork involved, but yeah, it's a magenta layer, and all I've done is I've taken back the saturation a little bit and adjusted the hue so it's a bit warmer so that her nipples don't stand out, and also this little belly at the front, which is so bloody cute. I felt like her little belly was a little bit cool as well, which you can see when I take that away. So I'm just warming that up a little bit as well. And there's a few others, like there's a few noses that I felt were a little bit cool. Because I did feel like her belly and those nipples still stood out a little bit too much, I brought in another layer just on a normal mode this time, and on a 10% opacity brush, I just sampled some of the skin so I had the right color, and then I just brushed over that real lightly. Another hue saturation level because I felt like this puppy stood out because he was too yellow, so I added more red. Now I'm really getting towards the end because I'm going to bring in one of my Florabella light overlays, basically to get a real slight, subtle, it doesn't look it at the moment, but it will be subtle flare effect right in the background. So I've brought that in, I've got it in screen mode, and I'm just adjusting it because I really just want it to peek in over the top of the photo. I don't want it affecting the dogs. I don't want it to look obvious, like, oh yeah, there's some flare added there. The issue for me was that the sun wasn't in the right spot. So I'm going to add that in later. And what I've done is I've used a hue saturation adjustment just to bring the red down because it's quite a red layer. And I'm adjusting it so that's a little more yellow, which suits, I think, the color of the trees in the background, a little bit more realistic. So I've dropped the opacity of the actual light layer way down, and then I'm using a mask to get rid of it from the puppies because that's not the look I want. I really just want it peeking in over the edge. So as you can see there, I'm just getting rid of it in front of the puppies. We don't want that at all. Following that, I've added 2 more levels and color balance adjustment layers just to bring in some specific editing to areas of the image like the haystack and the wheelbarrow. Then I went back to that shadows highlights layer. You might remember me saying that I thought that the tree area in the right hand corner looked a bit yuck, which obviously I've realized at this point, and I'm just going to add a mask and take away that area so it's not so distracting. And that's pretty much it. The only thing you've missed out on, because I stopped recording, was I did get rid of the 12-week-old puppy's collar. I felt like that was distracting since no one else is wearing a collar. And I also picked up a little bit of cloning issues, like in the haystack you can see where my hoodie was, like a few little details like that. And then of course there was a sharpen layer right at the end because I'm preparing that for print. I hope you've enjoyed watching and you got a few helpful tips for your own pet photography. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me a message. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ragamuffinphotography, or you can find the blog at ragamuffinpetphotography.com.au/blog. Once again, I'm Caitlin from Ragamuffin Pet Photography. I hope you have a wonderful time in your own photography business, and bye for now.